Hi, I'm Pastor Kerry. Before we get started, there are a few things I want to encourage you to have on hand. First, I want to encourage you to have a set of the sermon notes. If you don't already have them, you can go to the link that's right down below the video. It'll take you to a place where you can print a set of the sermon notes for yourself. I also want to encourage you to have some communion elements. You want to have some bread or a cracker. You want to have some juice or some wine. And if you don't have juice or wine, probably any beverage would suffice. But you want to have those communion elements because here in about 20 minutes, when we get to the end of the sermon, we'll move right into a time of communion with you. So, if you need any of those things, I would encourage you to pause the video right now. Grab whatever you need. Once everything is ready, then go ahead and resume the playback. So I've talked about this before, but I was not born and raised here in Lincoln, Nebraska. I was born and raised in the desert. I was born and raised in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And so all of the corn and all of the soybeans and all of the greenery that I see around me here in Nebraska during the spring and summer and fall, that is not something that I grew up around. I grew up around rocks and dirt and sand. And so I love being here in the Midwest where I get to enjoy all of the greenery around me. Now, it just so happens that as I was growing up, we did have a fair amount of greenery, at least in our yard. And part of the reason for that was because my father was, you'll have to forgive the pun here, but my father was transplanted from the Midwest also. My dad was born and raised in Indiana. And so when he moved from Indiana to New Mexico, he brought with him a love of all things green, and he always had a large garden in our backyard. And he would grow just about every vegetable imaginable in that garden. One of the things that he did at least one year, and I suspect that he did it more than once, but at least one year I remember that my dad grew a gigantic pumpkin. And he had this pumpkin vine, and at the end of the vine there was this huge pumpkin that he cared for all summer long and nurtured all summer long. And at the end of the summer, I remember that he entered it into a largest pumpkin contest. I was really young at the time, and so I don't remember if it was the prize-winning pumpkin or if it got honorable mention. I honestly don't remember. But I do remember that massive, massive pumpkin that my dad grew. And I also remember that when he entered that pumpkin in the contest, that I'm pretty sure, and again, memory's a little fuzzy, I think I was really young, but I think that he had entered it as having been grown by myself and my sister. I don't think that my sister or I had anything to do with the growth and nurturing of that pumpkin. I think it was all my dad, but nevertheless, I think that he said we were the ones who grew it. But the reason that I bring that up is because my dad certainly had a talent, again, being from the Midwest, being from Indiana, he had a talent for growing things and for nurturing things and for helping various different vegetable plants and vines to be fruitful. And the reason that I bring that up is because in our lectionary gospel reading that we're going to be taking a look at, the lectionary gospel reading for April 28th of 2024, Jesus is going to talk about a gardener and a vine and the branches and the fruitful nature or the non-fruitful nature of those branches. So let's go ahead and take a look at the lectionary gospel reading. It is John chapter 15, verses 1 through 8. This is Jesus speaking, and he says, "I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes, so that it will be even more fruitful. You already are clean because of the word I have spoken to you. Remain in me, as I also remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself, it must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me, and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. If you do not remain in me, you are like a branch that is thrown away and withers. Such branches are picked up, thrown into the fire, and burned. If you remain in me, and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. This is to my Father's glory, that you bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my disciples." May God bless the reading of the powerful and inspiring word. So my guess is that this is a passage with which you are at least passingly familiar. You are probably familiar with the passage in which Jesus talks about the fact that he is the vine and we are the branches. But it is an interesting passage, and at least in my humble opinion, there's some really interesting things in here. So what I'd like to do first of all is what we always do. Let's go ahead and talk through the passage. There are some little details that I want to point out to you in this passage. After we talk through the passage, then we'll focus on three of the lessons that this passage has for us as branches of the vine. So, one of the things that we should acknowledge right at the very top is that if you watched the sermon video from a couple of weeks ago, then you will recall that in that particular passage, Jesus said that he was the Good Shepherd. Jesus started our lectionary passage 2 weeks ago with the statement, I am the Good Shepherd. Now here we are 2 weeks later, and Jesus is starting this passage with the statement, I am the true vine. We talked about this a couple weeks ago, but if you didn't watch that video, one of the things that we always have to remind ourselves is that whenever Jesus says the words, I am, that it's a little bit of a loaded statement. And we have to remind ourselves that in the Old Testament, there was a time when God called on Moses and said, Moses, I want you to lead the Hebrew people out of slavery in Egypt. And Moses responded to God, well, sure, I'll go and I'll tell the Hebrew people that you've called on me to lead them out of slavery in Egypt, but they're going to want to know, God, who you are, and they are going to want to know your name. So when they ask me, who is this God that has sent you to lead us out of slavery, what should I tell them your name is? And God's response to Moses was, I am who I am. Tell them I am sent you. So, one of the names of God is simply I am. And so it's never a coincidence when Jesus starts a passage by saying, I am the true vine. Or in the passage we looked at 2 weeks ago, Jesus said, I am the good shepherd. Or in John chapter 16, when Jesus says, I am the way and the truth and the life. Not a coincidence. Whenever Jesus says those two words together, I am, Jesus is pointing to the fact that he is God in the flesh. In this case, he says, I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. So that is very interesting for us to think about, the fact that Jesus is saying he is the vine, and God is the gardener that takes care of the vine. Because then Jesus says that God cuts off every branch that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes it, so that it will be even more fruitful. Now again, for me, being from the desert, pruning is not a practice with which I am extremely familiar. Now, for those of you that have ever been in my office, you know that I've got books everywhere. I've got books on the shelves, I've got books on the floor, I've got all sorts of way too many theological resources at my disposal. And so to learn a little bit more about the process of pruning and perhaps the biblical implications of the process of pruning, I went to that great, revered, ancient theological resource, that being Wikipedia. and I looked up pruning, and look, it is exactly what you probably already know that it is, and it's something that I think I kind of knew that it was anyway, but I just needed a little bit of a reminder, a little bit of reinforcement. Pruning is simply the process of taking a look at a plant that should be producing, whether it should be producing fruit or whether it should be producing flowers or it should be producing vegetables, whatever the plant should be producing. If you've got a part of the plant that isn't producing, then you prune it. You cut it off. And it is through this process of pruning that hopefully you can cause the entire plant to be more productive, or the entire branch of this plant to be more productive. And one of the things that I wanted to point out to you that I think is very interesting, maybe it won't be interesting to you, but it is interesting to me, is that the word here in verse 2 for prunes, it comes from the Greek word Katharai. Katharai. And when you hear the word katharai, does that remind you of a certain English word? Because it reminds me of the English word cathartic. And it's no coincidence, because when I talk about the fact that perhaps last week when I was out of town and I was at a pastor's conference, I might say to you, it ended up being a very cathartic experience. Now, actually, cathartic isn't the word that I would use for my experience at the pastor's conference last week. It was a great conference. I learned a lot. I really had a nice time there. But cathartic has a different implication to it. So perhaps I could say, for a different example, I went and I saw a counselor a couple of weeks ago, and that particular session with that particular counselor, it was a very cathartic experience. So what does that mean? That means that it was painful, but it was also productive. There were good things that came from it. It was painful, but painful in a good way. And it's no surprise that the word that is translated pruning in this particular passage is also the word from which we get the English word cathartic. It comes from the Greek word katharai. So, Jesus then goes on to say that we are already clean. In other words, we have already been pruned because of the word that Jesus has spoken to us. And Jesus says, so you need to remain in me. And I know that you're probably thinking to yourself, well, do we have any choice? Well, I think we do have a choice. If Jesus is the vine and we are the branches, certainly we have a choice as to whether or not we choose to remain in Jesus. I mean, I think you understand that as a disciple. I understand that as a disciple. I have a choice whether or not I want to continue to be a disciple. I have a choice whether or not I want to continue to be a branch in the vine. But Jesus, as he continues with this illustration, he goes on to say, then in verse 5, we get into the second paragraph. He says, once again, I am the vine, you are the branches, as he said at the start of the passage in verse 1. He says, if we as the branches, if we remain in Jesus and Jesus remains in us, that we will bear much fruit, which is the whole point of a vine that's producing fruit. He says, on the other hand, apart from Jesus, we can do nothing. Jesus says, if you don't remain in me, you're like a branch that is thrown away and withers. Such branches are picked up, thrown into the fire, and burned. And I don't think any of us want to be tossed into the fire. I think all of us would rather remain in the vine and remain productive. Jesus says in verse 7, if you remain in me and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish and it will be done for you. And we're going to come back and we're going to talk a little bit more about verse 7 here in just a few minutes. But then Jesus concludes this illustration by saying this. This is to my Father's glory, that you bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my disciples. So in other words, Jesus is saying, hey, if we want to show that we are true disciples, then we need to do our very best to bear fruit. So what I want to do now is I want to talk about 3 of the lessons that this has for us. Last week, or rather 2 weeks ago, when we talked about the fact that Jesus was the good shepherd, we said that we are the sheep. Well, here we are 2 weeks later, and we've said that Jesus in this particular passage is the true vine, and we are the branches. So these are the lessons for us as branches. The first lesson is this. As branches, we may discover that the pruning process can be painful, but ultimately it can help us be more fruitful. As branches, we may discover that the pruning process can be painful, but ultimately it can help us be more fruitful. Because again, as we've already said, that's how the process of pruning works. That's why this is a good analogy. This is a good illustration that Jesus uses in this particular passage. We understand that when you go in and when you cut at certain branches, you cut certain parts away, you're doing that not haphazardly. You're not doing that in a way where you're just trying to be destructive. You're doing that in a very deliberate way. You're cutting here and you're cutting here. But the purpose of that is to help that branch to become even more fruitful. And I think that most of us, as we look back over the course of our lives, that we can probably identify moments in our lives that were painful. I can tell you that before I came to Southview Christian Church 14 years ago, that I had served at about half a dozen other churches in various capacities. And all of those churches, I had good experiences, and at least most of those churches, I had bad experiences as well. That's the nature of being a pastor. That's the nature of ministry. You go through the ups and downs. But as I reflect on my previous experiences at those half dozen churches over a couple of decades, and I think about the good times and the bad times, and I think about the painful moments, what I would certainly like to believe, and I certainly believe that it is true. It's not just that I want to believe it, but it is that I do believe it. I believe that there were times in my life and times in my ministry when God was going in and He was cutting. And there were painful moments in that process. But it ended up being cathartic. It ended up being productive. There were good things that came from those painful moments. I'd like to think that I learned from those, and I'd like to think that all of that helped to prepare me for the past 14 years and for the next 14 years that I'm going to serve at Southview Christian Church. That doesn't mean that I haven't had painful moments here as well. I'm sure that God has continued the pruning as I've served here at Southview. But all of this is simply to say that there are moments in our lives when God comes in and God cuts this and God cuts that. And I guess let me talk about this right now, because I'm afraid at the end of this sermon I'm going to run out of time like I always do. So let me just mention this to you right now. I want to encourage you in your next quiet time with God to say to God simply this: God, is there pruning that you need to do in my life right now? God, is there something that perhaps needs to be cut out of my life? Is there some painful process? Is there some cathartic process that you need to put me through right now so that I will be more fruitful, so that I will be a better disciple? I really want to encourage you to ask God about that in your next quiet time. Okay. All right, so that is the first lesson. The second lesson that this passage has for us as disciples is this: as branches, we need to receive nourishment from Jesus' words. As branches, we receive nourishment from Jesus' words. So Jesus mentions up in verse 3, you're already clean because of the word I have spoken to you. And then in verse 7, Jesus says, if you remain in me and my words, plural, remain in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. Look, one of the things that we know to be true about plants is there isn't a lot that they need to be sustained. Basically, what plants need to be sustained is they need water and they need sunlight. And that's about it. Yes, they need soil and they draw just a little bit of nutrients from the soil, but for the most part, plants are all about needing water and sunlight. And that is basically all that they need to draw upon. And friends, when you carry that analogy over to you and me and to all of us as disciples, as you carry that analogy over to the Christian life, what are the basic things that we need? Well, I think it's more than just water and sunlight. I think that all of us obviously need worship as a part of our lives. I think all of us need prayer as a part of our lives. But in this particular passage, Jesus makes reference more than once to the fact that we need His words, that we need the words contained in this book. And so it's probably a good reminder for all of us, even me, that this is a part of our sustenance as we continue to be a part of the vine and as we continue to serve the gardener, that we need to receive a good part of our sustenance from this word, and specifically from Jesus' words. All right, need to hurry along. I'm running out of time, just like I always do. The third lesson we want to take away from this passage is this: as branches, we fulfill the purpose of the true vine, and we bring glory to the gardener when we produce fruit. As branches, we fulfill the purpose of the true vine, and we bring glory to the gardener when we produce fruit. Now, when Jesus talks about producing fruit in this passage, there's no doubt that one of the implications is that we are producing fruit in an evangelistic sense, that we are disciples who are creating additional disciples. So there is certainly the evangelistic aspect to this passage. But I would also point out to you that one of the ways in which we produce fruit is we produce the fruit of the Spirit that Paul talks about in Galatians chapter 5, when Paul says that the fruit of the Spirit are love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and self-control. Those are some, not all, because I don't think I got the entire list there, but those are some of the fruits of the Spirit. Those are the fruits we're supposed to be displaying in our lives. So do we produce fruit in terms of evangelism? Yes, hopefully so. But do we produce fruits in terms of the fruit of the Spirit? My goodness, I certainly hope so. These are the ways in which we fulfill our calling. And at the end of the day, the gardener wants us to be producing fruit. The gardener is coming into our lives and is pruning and is causing catharsis in our lives so that we will produce fruit and hopefully produce even more fruit. And so another good question for us to ask ourselves is, are we producing the fruit that the gardener wants us to produce? And friends, at the end of the day, I hope that that is another question that you will ask God, and that you will perhaps be thinking a little bit more strategically about. What can you do? What can I do to produce more fruit in our lives? You know, one of the things that we've talked about in this passage is this idea of producing fruit. Jesus talks about the vine. There's no doubt that Jesus, in this particular passage, wasn't talking about a pumpkin vine when he talked about a vine. There's no doubt that Jesus was thinking of and talking about a grapevine. And friends, you know that every time we gather around the Lord's table, we partake of the bread, but when we partake of the cup, we're also partaking of the fruit of the vine. So it seems like an obvious segue as we move into our time of communion together. I would remind you of Jesus' words in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread. When he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me." So right now, I want you to grab your communion elements, and I'll go ahead and grab mine. We are running short on time. As always, the video is about to cut me off, but before it does, I want to invite you to partake with me. The body of Christ, broken for us, we partake in remembrance of him. And the blood of Christ shed for us, we drink in remembrance of him. Let us pray. God, we thank you for this time that we have to gather around this table and partake